Southend United in the Great War. The aim of this presentation is to give an overview of some of the players who had connections to the football team Southend United and look at their service in the Great War. This is in no way complete. I've identified about 22 or 23 players, and there is a bias towards players that's played with Southend United before the Great War. I'm sure there's a whole other project I could be doing looking at people that returned to play at Southend United or played after the First World War. Well, quick bit of background to Southend United. In Southend at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a very popular movement for amateur football, but there wasn't a professional football team. There was interest in setting up a professional football team. A meeting was held in this pub here, the Blue Boar pub, on the 19th of May 1906, and decision was made to form a team, almost called Thiepval United, because that's actually the district where this all sits in, but the decision was made to call it Southend United. Part of their plan was they bought ground or planned to buy ground that's marked here as sandpits just underneath the word Thiepval, and that is actually the location of the current ground, Roots Hall. However, Southend were to play at a number of different sites over their history through to now 2026. Here's a photo of the original team from 1906. As with many new football teams, it's my opinion that they had to scout around and recruit people from all over the place. That included players who had been in the amateur side of things, but it also included players who perhaps were on this or downward trajectory of their career. They also relied upon a lot of personal connections, and we see here Robert or Bob Jack in the right hand corner as the secretary and manager, and a number of players that pass through our story had personal connections to him. The black and white picture doesn't show it, but the Southend United are famously called the Blues, and we can see here perhaps why. The original strip was blue. The logo in on the right hand side was their sort of emblem at the time, very closely related to emblems used by Southend-on-Sea as a borough. How were they doing? Well, not that well, which perhaps is a story that's familiar to people that support Southend. We can see here results from 1909-1910 season, and Southend just avoid relegation from the Southern League Division 1. Perhaps to celebrate this, they went on tour that summer, and their tour took them to Germany, where they played a number of games. This is a picture taken at one of the games against Union Berlin, which ultimately Southend United was to win 4-0. Now, these players aren't necessarily in order, but the players in the photo are Percy Toone, Tom Murray, Jerry Thompson, Ernest Emery, Albert Frost, Billy Harrower, Louis Park, and I believe that's the goalkeeper, the tall guy there, William Sutherland, Alex King, George Harrod, and Edward Anderson, often called Dits Anderson. And in the first game, as I've already said, I think that they won that game 4-1, or 4-0, with King scoring 3 goals and Harrod scoring 1. They then moved on and played a couple of different games. The only one they lost actually was against Hertha Berlin, and they moved to Magdeburg and defeated Victoria 1896 Plaza by 8-2. King scored another hat-trick in this game. Harrod scored 2. Ernest Emery, Billy Sutherland and Albert Frost completing the scorecard. They then played a team called Harlan Hohenzollern, and they again won there 3-1, with King again scoring, Sutherland scoring, and Dits Anderson also scoring. They returned to Berlin and actually played another English team which was on tour, Oxford City, and beat them 10-0, with King this time scoring a double hat-trick, Billy Sutherland scoring 2, Murray and Emery also scoring as well. And the final tour match took place in Hamburg, where Combine were defeated by 4-1. Returning to the domestic league, the news wasn't so good for the next season, as Southend were to be relegated, and it's a story that's familiar throughout Southend United's history of kind of popping up and down between various leagues. The 1914-1915 season was to be kind of interrupted by the war, but this is a picture showing the team strip as worn at the time, and again we can see that the logo or team motto, whatever you want to call it, has moved on slightly, but again is very much in keeping with that of Southend-on-Sea as a corporation. Just to give you some sort of bits and pieces and background to things that were going on. We see here, this is from Christmas 1913, and the Southern League, Southend United 3, Crystal Palace 3, at Roots Hall, Priswell on Christmas Day. Despite an increase in the prices, well over 5,000 people were present. And the kind of reports on the game, and perhaps having a score draw with Crystal Palace wasn't so bad, because in that season they would come second in the league, whereas we can see Southend is much further down in the 16th position. So as we approach the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, it would appear for many football teams it was business as usual. We can see here the Essex County Chronicle, dated Friday, August the 7th, 1914. So the war had actually technically broken out by now, but things are carrying on as normal. And we can see a report that a player has been signed. And this is Spencer Bassett, and we'll talk about him in more detail in a little while, but he was one of those footballers that had played at many, many different teams and was perhaps on this sort of downward trajectory when he came to Southend United. Another signing from this point, and this is the 21st of August 1914, we can see Southend United have engaged two of last season's West Ham United players, and that's Lonsdale, and that is Thomas Lonsdale, we can see on the screen there, and then another player called Burrell. Now, 21st of August 1914, the British military were kind of out, not yet fighting on the Western Front, but then would be imminently. And the man that was to be involved in that was the following guy, and this is William Sutherland. Now, you remember he's been mentioned in some of the earlier slides and pictures. He was on that 1910 tour of Germany. He was from Falkirk in Scotland and had served with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders in the South African campaign of 1899 to 1902. Whilst in the army, he was a keen footballer and was a gym instructor, and on leaving the military, the then manager of the Blues, Mr. Bob Jack, signed him for Southend United. He played for 2.5 seasons for the Blues, scoring many goals along the way, and was also, as we already know, part of the team that toured Germany in 1910. He met his wife Enid whilst living in Southend, and by 1914 they had 2 children. He left Southend United and moved to Plymouth Argyle, and that's the strip he's wearing in this picture. And the reason probably for that was that Bob Jack was then the manager of Plymouth Argyle. Sutherland later moved on to Chatham FC, and when his football career came to an end, he returned to Southend, where he lived with his wife at 44 North Avenue, though he later moved to 63 North Avenue, and there's a street map there for any of you that know the Southend-on-Sea area. He was appointed groundsman and caretaker at the opening of the Jones Memorial Ground for Children in Southend under the Southend Educational Committee, and that's just slightly to the sort of north of the bit of the map that you can see there. Now, I already mentioned he served in the Argyll and Southern Highlanders before the war, and it looks like as a reservist he returned to them, and he was to take part in the actions at the Battle of Le Cateau, which we can see here. In previous videos on my channel, I've looked at the 2nd Essex, who were part of the 4th Division over on the left-hand side of the battlefield here, and this was their first engagement. The Argyll and Southern Highlanders were part of the 5th Division over on the right-hand side of the battlefield. And here we see a picture of William in his uniform as a sergeant of the 2nd Battalion Argyll and Southern Highlanders. Unfortunately, William was to be killed in action on this day, the 26th of August 1914, and he has no known burial and is therefore commemorated on the Lijssenthoek Memorial. Sorry, I'm sure I've mispronounced that correctly, or mispronounced that. So whilst William was killed in perhaps the British Army's 2nd action after the Battle of Mons, he was killed at Le Cateau on the 26th of August, quite possibly the first, if not one of the first, professional footballers to be killed in the First World War. Now, speaking of professional football, it carried on at home, and we can see here a list of results for the rest of the season. Again, a familiar thing for many people from Southend or support Southend to see a bit of hope at the beginning of the season, and then things go up and down throughout. Another thing that might be a little bit familiar is the idea of pitches, and just recently in early 2026 Southend United's had a run of games being cancelled both home and away because of pitches, and we can see here that a game against Swindon Town was abandoned through rain due to problems with the pitch. However, there's a couple of references in here, including one inside that red box, to the goalkeeper making saves. Higher up, Onsdale saved this shot by throwing himself at full length, and then within the box a foul was awarded just outside the penalty area. They took the kick and sent in a smashing drive, but Lonsdale caught the ball on the line and cleared cleverly. And this is Thomas Stewart Lonsdale that we referred to a bit earlier on, who came to the team from West Ham. He was originally from Bishop's Auckland and played for some local teams, Grimsby Town, Port Vale. He then also played at West Ham, as we know, and also at Southend United. I don't have a lot of detail on him, but he did serve during the First World War. He joined the Middlesex Regiment, serving in the 17th Service Battalion. Now, as was common with service battalions, not exclusive but common too, they had nicknames, and the 17th Middlesex were known as the 1st Footballers Battalion. Now, however, his medal index card showed he also served periods with the 13th Battalion and the 20th Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment, and as far as I can tell, he survived the war. So whilst the soldiers are going off to fight, they're kind of still games being carrying on, and this is from early 1915. So we see that Southend United surprisingly beat Bristol Rovers 3-0, and a player called Wileman scored 2 and Frost scored. Now Wileman, this is probably Henage Wileman, but I just ask you to keep that name in your mind as we go further into this talk. As mentioned already, we can see that the league carried on here, and there you are, FA Cup first round. Southend United beat Bristol Rovers 3-0, and in the newspaper article it said about how they would go and play Burnley in the next round, who they subsequently lost 6-0 to. So the 1914-15 season was to continue, as we've just seen here. It goes all the way through to May 1915, but this is the kind of league at the end of the year. But it's quite surprising to think of the football continuing, because for some of the soldiers, some of the players were much more involved in different things by then. And a good example is Edward Anderson, who we met briefly earlier as part of the team that toured Germany. Now, he was born in Prittlewell in 1890, the son of Charles and Jane Anderson. He was one of 5 children, and they lived in Chelmsford Road, and a little picture here showing roughly where that is. And by the outbreak of the war, he'd moved to North Road, Southend. Now, he was called Edward, but many people called him by a nickname Dits. He went to a local school called Lee Road School and moved on to Southend High School for boys. And whilst he was at Lee Road, his cleverness as a footballer was noticed, and he played football for them for 3 or 4 seasons. He was the captain. He selected to play several representative matches and was recipient of at least 2 championship medals. He joined Southend United as an inside forward, and he played for them for 2 seasons, and his appearances were slightly limited, but as we already know, he was part of the team that toured in 1910. He just subsequently moved on to a team called Woolwich Arsenal. I don't know whatever happened to them, but anyway, he did good work for them, and in 1913 he went to live at Tottenham. There's no clear evidence this was anything to do with football. And he was still living in that area when in January 1915, which is the time of the FA Cup game we were just looking at, he joined up the army. He joined up in Shoreditch, and he joined the Royal Engineers. And we can see his medal index card here that shows that on the 20th of July 1915 he moved across to France, though France was used as a colloquialism for both France and Belgium. It may well have been to France in the first case though. And you may well notice the DOW on there as well, because unfortunately he did die of wounds. He was serving with the 56th Field Company Royal Artillery. He was mortally wounded by a shell on December the 10th, only 4 days after having taken position in the front lines. He received dreadful injuries to his back and head and was immediately removed for medical assistance. The following day he succumbed to his wounds at No. 7 Casualty Clearance Station, and he's now buried at Lijssenthoek Military Cemetery. Looking at Commonwealth War Grave Commission records, he's listed as the son of Charles Anderson of 263 North Road, Prittlewell, Southend-on-Sea. And you can see Roots Hall Stadium actually marked on this map where Dits Anderson would have played. Carrying on though, this is a little bit of a mystery which I haven't yet got to the bottom of. You can see it's an excerpt from the Southend Standard and Essex Weekly Advertiser, and it mentions a well-known footballer obtains a commission. And this is Sergeant Douglas Adams of the Sportsmen's Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, who played football for Southend United and Southend Amateurs, has obtained a commission as a second lieutenant in the Northumberland Fusiliers. I have been trying to track this down, looking at army lists and so on, but I haven't managed to find any further detail. So that's another sort of case still running. about this sort of time as well. This is a picture from the Southend Standard newspaper, part of its photo supplement that was occasionally issued. Not a great picture, I'm afraid, but it does say that Southend United survives a U-boat attack. And it's a picture of, say, a person in a little boat. The U-boat has fired, and the torpedo going past has the words liquidation on it, because at this point Southend United was experiencing many financial difficulties. So we move on to the next player, and this is Harry Owen. Now, Harry Owen was actually born in Northampton, but he moved to Southend and lived with his sister, who was a twin sister, at Ivor Villa, Horace Road, Southend. And again, if any of you know the Southend seafront's just off the bottom of this map. The Royal Shopping Centre's off to the left, as you can see marked, and we can see Horace Road marked there. Now, this is a bit of a write-up from a football thing, but Owen was part of a team that historically beat the then mighty Clapham Orient in the November 1907 Cup tie, so an early player for the club. A football writer at the time wrote of Owen's performance, "It was one of those games which made an indelible impression on my brain." And he gets a number of write-ups, including a game where he excelled against Millwall in September 1908, where someone wrote about his performance that it will not readily fade from public memory how he checkmated every move of the Lions' attack and kept on putting his own forwards in motion, stamped him as a master of tactics. Unfortunately, in a bit of a cruel twist of fate, he suffered a severe thigh injury whilst playing away at his home club, Northampton, and this brought an end to his playing career on December the 30th, 1909. On that day, with his injury, the team fell apart, suffering their heaviest ever defeat at the time, 11-1. The one Southend goal was scored by William Sutherland, who we've already heard about being killed on the 26th of August 1914. Owen never really recovered full fitness, and despite turning out for the Blues when they were in desperate need, his playing days were over. However, he kept a keen interest in the club and followed their fortunes with great enthusiasm. Now, once the war came around, he joined up, and he joined the 27th Service Battalion, known as the 1st Sportsmen's of the Fusiliers, which is probably the same battalion that perhaps was mentioned with Sergeant Douglas Adams a few minutes ago. And he was out on the Western Front by the early part of 1916. And we have a little excerpt here. Alas, at 3:55, just 5 minutes before he would have been relieved, a trench mortar bomb came over. One of his comrades wrote at home to his sister, takes up the story. Owen saw it coming and gave a warning to his section, with the result that he saved the lives of 3 parts of the section. The mortar, however, burst right in front of him, inflicting 40 or 50 wounds on the unfortunate man. He was not killed outright. But lived about an hour in an unconscious condition, and then passed peacefully away. He was buried by the chaplain, Reverend A.G. Duffin, in an orchard set aside as the cemetery for British troops near the lines where he fell. His comrades have erected an admirable cross to mark the spot where he was laid to rest. And he now lays in 11 Communal Cemetery Extension with a date of death of the 13th of March 1916. Now, speaking of deaths of players, Harry's death was reported in the local newspapers, as we can see here, from the 24th of March 1916, and it notes that he is the 3rd player to have been killed, as Dits, or Dilly Sutherland, fell at Mons, and Dits Anderson had died with the Royal Engineers. And we've talked about them already, but one other soldier that would have a link to Southend United and who died by this point was William Kennedy. Now, the paper was from March 1916, and William Kennedy's story comes to a finish before that. It was from Grays and played at Southend United, and he only played for a few occasions, having come from a period at Northfleet, and he then, funnily enough, in exchange of players, moved on to play at West Ham. He joined them in 1910, scoring on his debut, and the following season got a hat-trick against Brentford. However, with echoes of some of the other players, he then suffered a serious knee injury, and that ended his West Ham career. When the war came around, he joined up, and he joined the 1st 14th County of London Battalion, better known as the London Scottish. And he was involved in fighting in October 1915 around the area of Loos, more specifically in an attack upon the Hohenzollern Redoubt, which is the red trenches marked next to the little green dropped icon. And he was killed in action on the 13th of October 1915, and unfortunately he has no known grave and is therefore commemorated on the Loos Memorial to the missing. On the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website, it says that he was from the A Company and he was the son of John and Jeannie Kennedy of 31 Cromwell Road, Grays, Essex. And just playing around with some mapping, this is the trench map superimposed with the current day Google mapping, and you might see over to the top left side there's a little cemetery, and that is Quarry's Cemetery, which is one of the famous cemeteries on the Loos battlefield, because it's believed that the Queen Mum's brother is buried there. Returning to our Southend players though, we have Patrick McLaughlin. Now Patrick didn't spend all that much time at Southend as far as I'm aware. He was a Northerner, first playing for Blaydon United, moved to Hepburn, Argyle, then to Chorley, back to Hepburn, and then ultimately he was to move down south in 1909 and join Fulham at that time in the second division. However, he appears to play for them only twice, but he did score 1 goal. He then moved to Wallsend Park Villa before then joining Southend United. I don't know how long he was with Southend United, but ultimately he was to return back to North East to Yarrow Caledonians. Now, Patrick, as with some of the other players we've met, had previously served in the army and at the outbreak of the war rejoined, and was serving as a company sergeant major with the 1st Battalion of the Northumberland Fusiliers, and was killed in action on the 27th of March 1916. The Commonwealth War Grave, he has no known burial and is commemorated on the Menin Gate. Commonwealth War Grave Commission information says that he served with X-Company of the 1st Battalion of the Northumberland Fusiliers and was the son of Michael and Mary McLaughlin of 32 Stanley Street, Yarrow, County Durham, and was the husband of Helena McLaughlin of 1 James Street, Hepburn, County Durham. Carrying on as we move forward here, we now see July 1916. Another newspaper article picks up a Southend United player, and it's Private Archie Wilson of the London Scottish, a well-known player of Southend United Football Club, has been killed in action. And here we see a picture of Archie. He was from Cumberslung in Scotland and had developed an early interest in football, and before he left school he was regarded as an up-and-coming player. He played for some junior Scottish interleague cups and then moved to Nottingham. He was signed for Spurs at the age of 18, but perhaps was a bit too young to kind of make an impact. And in 1911, Wilson was signed to Southend United from Spurs for the sum of £50. And this was later called one of the most judicious £50 ever spent by the club. Now, Southend this was one of the seasons where they were in deep relegation trouble and looked doomed to be relegated. And Wilson, whilst joining the club, is still quite young, joined them late in the season, had an impact upon the club's fortunes. However, it wasn't to be the kind of full romantic story. It came down to the last game of the season. Southend needed to win at New Brompton, but they also needed Bristol Rovers to lose at Brighton. Now, the Blues did their bit. They beat New Brompton, but Bristol managed to draw, and therefore Southend were relegated. However, their form of the late of the season, perhaps due to Archibald Wilson joining them, had seen a turn, and so spirits were up. Now, Archie Wilson joined. I've jumped forward a little bit there, but basically he spent some time playing for Southend and formed a partnership with another player called Wildman, and this is that Hinage Wildman that we saw in one of the earlier slides, scoring 2 goals. They were a very good scoring duo and worked together well, but they also became friends and socialised as well. And whilst Wilson was only fairly small by measures of the time, he was 5'7" and weighed about 10.5 stone. He was known as being fearless and to take on anybody. Now, the Southend United regained promotion back in 1913, back to Division 1 of the Southern League, and their partnership continued to help the club and move it forward. A scout, then the manager of Middlesbrough, came to Southend to watch them play Coventry because he had his eye on a Coventry player, but he was so taken by Wilson that he made immediate moves to sign him. And the deal ultimately went through for £400, and whilst Wilson completed the last 2 games of the season for Blues, his association with the club was at the end. He moved to Middlesbrough and made 21 appearances, scoring 4 goals before the war put an end to his footballing career. Initially, he got a job in a munitions factory, but he felt this wasn't for him, so he returned south and enlisted also in the London Scottish Battalion, as we've already seen mentioned. But he did manage to fit in 10 guest appearances for Spurs during this period while he was down south in training. As much of his training was at Purfleet in Essex, it gave him the opportunity to return to Southend, and he told people at the time, like a sports writer, that he was fond of Southend and his heart would always be with the club. Now, Archie was serving with the 14th County of London Battalion, better known as the London Scottish, and he was killed in action on the 1st of July 1916 near and is commemorated on the Thiepval Memorial because he has no known grave. We can see the official history map here of the attack at Gomercourt, which was part of the big attack on the 1st of July 1916, a very famous day in British military history, or infamous day. And just down at the bottom end you can see LS, that's the London Scottish, and they were attacking towards a farmyard and farm, Fable, and that area there. Again, I've got another little map here that perhaps shows the area a little bit more. And finally, we have like an overlay of the modern day town over that kind of area, and we can see there's a number of British military cemeteries there due to the number of casualties on that day. Next, we return to Spencer Bassett, who we saw a bit earlier being signed for Southend in August 1914. He was actually from Blackheath, Kent, born there in July 1885, and had spent time at Arsenal before moving to Swansea Town and then ultimately moving to Southend United. He also played at Exeter and moved around from club to club, as I've already said. And he signed, as we know, in August 1914 for Southend United, and therefore his time there was going to be disrupted by the outbreak of the war and the cessation of the football season. Now, Spencer Bassett joined the Royal Garrison Artillery in Woolwich in December 1915, which is after the football season had stopped. And he was to bounce around between various units, but ultimately he went over to France in August 1916 and was serving with a heavy artillery group. By Christmas 1916, 27th December to be precise, he'd actually been appointed as an acting bombardier, so he was clearly showing some sort of leadership potential. And in April 1917, he'd moved to the 14th Heavy Artillery Group, which was supporting the 1st Anzac Corps 5th Army. And those of you know kind of your military history stuff will know that they were taking part in an attack on a village called Bullecourt on the 11th of April 1917. 11th of April 1917. It was during this action that Bassett was wounded by German counter-battery fire, but whilst he was evacuated to the rear, he died of his injuries and is buried at Pozières British Cemetery. Whilst I've been going through the local papers finding out this type of information, I came across this story here of a Mrs. Mary Fauschenberger, who was living in Burgess Road, Fort Bay, which is quite a posh area, I think some people would say. And the basic story is that she was arrested for not having a permit because she was a foreigner, even though she was British by birth and wanted to be called Falconer. And in the article it says that the woman had the misfortune to marry a German, but she had not seen him for 20 years. Players from Southend that served in the war, continuing onwards, we have Frederick Robson. I'm afraid I don't have a lot of information about Frederick Robson. He seems to be from the north of England because he played for Sunderland, Durham City, Hartlepool. He also came to Southend, and it looks like he then went to Swansea. There seems to be quite an interchange, I guess, because they were in the same league. He did join up. He served in the army. He joined the Middlesex Regiment, the 17th Battalion of Middlesex Regiment, which, as you remember, is the first of footballers. And I can't find any other records, so I believe he survived the war. Another team member was Maurice Woodward from Enderby, Leicestershire. He played Leicestershire Fosse. He also played for Bristol Rovers. He played for Southend United, and I think he left them for Wolverhampton Wanderers. But when he joined up the army, he joined the Middlesex Regiment. He reached the rank of sergeant, and he served with the 17th Service Battalion, which, as we now well know, was nicknamed the First of Footballers. Quite a sort of striking picture, this one. This is Bert Shiner, and he served in the Royal Navy, where he kind of picked up his skills or was spotted as being a good footballer, but he was also a talented performer on the athletics track, winning many races. He moved around from a footballing side of things, and he played for Watford. He then comes to Southend, and he actually, interestingly, spent 3 periods serving with the Royal Navy, 2 of them pre-war, 1894 to 1902, then 1903 to 1908, and then he returned to the Navy during the First World War, serving in 1916 on a mine layer. Now, ultimately, he was invalided out of the military as he had tuberculosis, and he worked as a poultry farmer during the last years of his life, and he died on the 10th of November 1921. Now we return to this picture from the Union Berlin Southend United game in 1910 because I haven't identified a picture of the player I'm about to tell you about, but he is in this picture. And this is Percy Toone. Now he was born in July 1883 in Colchester, Essex, and whilst also being a footballer, he was also quite a good cricketer. He began with a team called Woolwich Arsenal, and which, as I'm sure you've worked out, is now called Arsenal, but he didn't make many first-team appearances, and he subsequently joined Southend United in December 1909, making 23 Southern League and 4 FA Cup appearances in that season. Ultimately, in late 1910, so after this tour to Germany, he moved to Preston North End, then to Bolton Wanderers, and then the war stopped the football season. Besides playing football, he also was king cricketer, and he made his first-class debut for England on the 1st of July 1912 against Kent at the Bat and Ball Ground, Gravesend. And he appeared in 2 further matches that year and won in 1913, and was a right-arm fast bowler and a right-handed batsman. He enlisted in the army during the First World War and served again with the Royal Garrison Artillery, and was to move around through different units such as the 12th Siege Battery, the 301st Siege Battery, but ultimately at some point was transferred to the Labour Corps, where he was assigned to the 122nd Prisoner of War Company, which focused on labour and support tasks relating to prisoner management. Now, interestingly, Percy Toone is one of those that did return to football after the war, and he also took up his cricket again. And if I got it right, I think he returns to Gillingham as a player. I don't have the club he returns to, but he does return to football and his cricket after the war. The next player listed is a bit of a mystery. He is Ernest Hanks. Ernest was from Camberley, Surrey, and he played at various times for Arsenal, Brentford and Southend United. He, according to the Footballers in the Great War website, joined up and served with the Army Service Corps with their 3rd Field Bakery, and they say that he went across to France on the 12th of August 1914, and they list him as killed in action or died during the war. But I can't find any record to support this, so this is one I'm going to again have to keep on my list and keep the research going. This next player is Alexander Steele. Now, Alexander Steele was born in July 1886 in New Milne, Scotland. He played football as a forward and a right midfielder, and the list of clubs I'm about to tell you, I believe, are in the correct order: Manchester City, Tottenham Hotspur, FC Barcelona, Kilmarnock, Southend United and Gillingham. Whilst playing for FC Barcelona, he won 2 Pyrenees Cups with them in 1912 and 1913, and he was playing with Southend United, I believe, when the war broke out. He joined the military, and I think he served in the Royal Naval Air Service in some sort of ground support role, but I don't have much detail. And I believe he transferred into the Royal Air Force in April 1918, as did many people from the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps. And it would appear that his career, or his credit, if you like, for playing at Gillingham was a post-war credit, because that's the team he played for after the First World War. Now, you might remember earlier on I said to you about trying to keep an eye on Wildman and try and remember that name, and that is because of the guy on the screen now, Arthur Wildman. His brother, Heneage Wildman, was the player that was being quoted earlier on, and both of them were from Derbyshire. It looks like they played for some local teams, but then both were picked up for Chelsea. However, they didn't necessarily stay at Chelsea let me just kind of get this right for you. They originally played for Burton United, and then they moved on to Chelsea, both of the Wildman brothers, and they scored goals against, this one scored goals against Woolwich Arsenal, but the team still lost. And despite a good start to his Chelsea career and a couple of excellent games, he never fulfilled his full potential. And because they brought in another player called Bob Whittington from Bradford City for £1,300, which was obviously a fortune in those days, this ended his career at Chelsea, where he'd scored 5 league goals. He moved to Millwall and then to Luton Town before joining Southend United, and he joined him just in the run-up to the war. And he didn't really have much impact or chance to make an impact on the Southend United before the war kicked in. So he joins, and you probably guessed this already, he joins Middlesex Regiment, the 17th Service Battalion, known as the 1st Footballers, but he didn't serve with them completely throughout his service. I recently found a reference in a book about footballers in the Great War to the fact that he took part in a football match in mid to late April 1917, around August time 1917, and it was like a charity match, a beneficial match for a player from Reading who had been killed in the First World War. And one of the battalions that were based nearby, the 27th Service Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment, put a football team up against Reading. And at the time he was a corporal. Corporal Arthur Wildman was part of the team that played for that. And the article, the book mentions that many of them had previously served at the front. And it would appear that he returned to the front, serving at various times with the 8th Service Battalion of the Sussex Regiment, and then the 11th Service Battalion, Sussex Regiment. And in January 1918, Sergeant Wilman, as he was by then, is mentioned in the London Gazette as having been awarded a military medal. So often there's a lag of about 3 months between the events that the medal was about and it being gazetted, as it was called. So this would suggest perhaps September 1917. So it sounds like just after the football match he returned to the front, and I'd imagine it was probably to do with the Third Battle of Ypres that he won his military medal. In April 1918, he was taking part in a patrol with one officer and one other man, and all 3 men seemed to have been killed whilst on that patrol. And perhaps because they were out in no man's land, their bodies weren't recovered or weren't identified properly, and all 3 are now commemorated on the Tyne Cot Memorial to the missing. And so Arthur was killed on the 28th of April 1918. Now, I mentioned footballers in the Great War, and the First World War, sorry. This is a website that I've relied upon heavily, and the QR code on screen will take you to that nice and quickly and easily. There are some other resources that I've used, but I hope that you found this an interesting view of the experiences of Southend United players in the Great War. And as I said, it's not a done deal. There's more research to be done. So thank you.